You're not there?
I am not there, and Josh doesn't arrive until the 23rd.
Oh, he's going? Oh, okay. For that working group?
For the working group, and he's speaking in the high-level panel, technical briefing.
Yeah, I forgot. Yeah. Yep, I'll be back here by Monday.
Andres is joining us. Great. And hello, colleagues. You'll notice that as you come on board, my name is Susan Wilburn. I'm the International Sustainability Director and will be the moderator and host for this webinar. Welcome. We'll be starting in about 7 minutes. Participants have all been muted as you join, and excuse us for some early logistics discussion before we get started.
Hi, Andres. Welcome. Could we just test your sound real quick?
Hello. Good morning. How are you?
Perfect. You sound great. Excellent.
Okay.
Hello, Andres. Susan here. Great to have you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Susan. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this ethylene oxide situation.
Very important work.
Thank you.
And I don't know that you've met your co-speaker, Dr. Oris, who is online.
Hi there.
How are you, Mr. Peter Oris?
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. Just a second, please. So we are right away ready for the presentation.
Yes.
Okay, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Yes, we're ready to go. We still have 4 minutes to the half hour when we're scheduled to start. And a number of participants are continuing to arrive. And hello, colleagues. This is Susan Wilburn. I'll be the moderator. And as you've noticed, you have been put on mute as participants as you join the call. We should be starting in the next 5 minutes. Welcome.
Nick, do the slides come back up for me again when I start? Because I have a web page here now that says thanks for using Cisco WebEx.
Yep, I'll bring them back up right here on the screen when it's your turn.
I got you. Thank you.
No problem.
Peter?
Okay, so we're still on. Get nervous.
Yes, we're on.
Anyone.
We're just, there's a number of people who are joining the call that are just setting up sound, so we'll start in a minute.
Gotcha.
Hello, colleagues. This is Susan Wilburn. I'm the International Sustainability Director for Healthcare Without Harm and want to welcome you all to the webinar on ethylene oxide, its use, hazard, health impact, and safer substitution. We are delighted to have you with us today. Good morning to those of you in the Americas. Good afternoon to Europe and Southern Africans. And good evening to the colleagues who are joining us from Asia and Southeast Asia. I see a number of colleagues who are continuing to join us and working on their sound. I'm going to go through the introductions to this webinar with our two speakers as you are joining. What you will notice is that all participants have been muted on arrival. We will have an opportunity towards the last 10-15 minutes of the hour for questions and answers. When you are, if you have questions, if you put them in either the chat box of this WebEx or in the question and answer forum within the WebEx, we will receive your questions and I will provide them for the speakers at that time. At any time during this session, you can add questions to the question and answer or chat box, and we will receive them. With that, let's get started. I'm delighted to have you all here with us today and to talk about this very important issue of the high-level disinfectant sterilant ethylene oxide that is widely used in healthcare and industrial settings throughout the world. With some new information that has just come to us. This webinar we're presenting at the end of the celebration of what's called Worker Memorial Day or the World Day for Safety and Health at Work. This year's theme of Worker Memorial Day is that of chemicals and occupational cancers, of which ethylene oxide is an example. And so we are joining together with our international trade union colleagues and labor organization colleagues to participate in educating health workers on how to prevent exposure to occupational carcinogens. This webinar is a webinar of the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals Network, together with the Sustainable Health in Procurement Project of Healthcare Without Harm and UNDP. GGHH is an international network of hospitals, healthcare facilities, health systems, and health organizations, all of whom dedicated to reducing the environmental footprint of healthcare and health sector operations to promote public and environmental health. We have a 10-goal framework in our foundation. These are 10 interconnected goals connected to each other and in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals to address and promote greater sustainability and environmental health. You can see on the screen the list of the 10 goals: leadership, chemicals, waste, energy, water, transportation, food, pharmaceuticals, buildings, and purchasing. And this webinar today is an illustration of action on 3 or 4 of the goals, including leadership, education, and advocacy, including the goal of safer chemicals and on safer, more sustainable procurement as we're looking at the alternatives to ethylene oxide. The Global Green and Healthy Hospitals Network is composed of 1,193 member organizations in 58 countries that represent the interests of over 36,000 hospitals and healthcare facilities, health centers. You can see on this map what countries are active members of the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals Network. You can also see on this map where we have regional offices and strategic partners. These are the red dots. We have major offices in Brussels for the European Union and Belgium, in just outside of Washington, D.C. for North America, and an office in Manila in the Philippines for Southeast Asia. There's also strategic partners in Brazil, in Argentina, in Australia, in India, in Nepal, in China, as well as South Africa. And we have representatives on this call today from all of those regions. So again, welcome to you. The Global Green and Healthy Hospitals has a large system of programs and benefits. We've talked about the comprehensive agenda of goals, for which we have guidance documents on actions related to those goals, a data center to measure your footprint and to track progress as you implement and take action on the goals. One of the major goals is around the healthcare climate challenge to protect public health from climate change. The guidance documents you can see on screen, buildings, water, waste, and energy, are available to members through the Connect network. And we have 2 upcoming guidance documents on sustainable procurement and chemicals to come out later this year. We have a series of webinars, such as this one, and a website and YouTube site where the recordings of the webinars are located. This webinar will be uploaded approximately 2 weeks after the session. There's case studies on the greenhospitals.net website on each of the goals and challenge areas. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for today. We have 2 speakers, 2 distinguished speakers. The first speaker will be Dr. Peter Oris, who is a professor and chief of service at the Occupational Health Service Institute within the University of Illinois Hospital and Health System in Chicago in USA. The work of Dr. Oris has been critical to the worldwide environmental health movements. He was one of Healthcare Without Harm's founders in 1996 and has advised communities all over the world on the dangers of incineration and toxic chemical exposures. On behalf of Healthcare Without Harm and the World Medical Association, Dr. Orris attended every negotiating session of the Minamata Treaty on Mercury, which, as you know, came into full force after adoption. And this is the first international environmental convention that has specific language about the health sector's role. He's been active in involvement on identifying alternatives and implementation of alternatives to chemicals in healthcare settings. Welcome, Peter. Our next webinar speaker, who will be providing a case study of implementation of substitution of ethylene oxide, is Andres Alvarado. He is the head of facilities management environment for Clínica Bíblica in Costa Rica. He has 19 years of experience in issues related to health and safety, facilities and environment. And as a result of his work at Clínica Bíblica, the hospital has obtained local and international certification such as Ecological Blue Flag, Carbon Neutrality, and JCI, or Joint Commission International. Andres has a bachelor's in industrial engineering, a master's in occupational health with an emphasis on environmental hygiene, as well as training in the upper course in management in integrated security for a foundation in Madrid, Spain. In addition, he has been an auditor for the processes of verification of greenhouse gas inventories and carbon neutrality. His academic and professional experience includes visits to hospitals in Germany, Brazil, Israel, and Venezuela, where the latter of which he developed a process of audit of safety for installations. Welcome, Andres. And with that, I would like to turn the microphone and the ball over to Dr. Orris.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. These slides, as you reminded me, will need to go quite quickly for me to fit within the time sequence. And I notice I still have on the screen Andre's bio.
Peter, can you click on your name at the top?
Click on my name at the top.
So your slides will come up.
Panelists 4.
It should say Orris ETO briefing, or Nick, do you want to take over the ball?
I got you. Thank you.
Great.
And I noticed that I have a defect already on the first slide. Since these will be going very quickly, I wanted to put my email there so anybody needed to follow up, we could discuss any more specific points. That email is Porris, that is in P as in Peter, ORRIS at uic.edu, uic.edu. And
Peter, we'll put that in the chat box.
I should put that in the chat. Let me.
No, I'll do that for you. You just go ahead.
It's a deal. Okay. Thank you. And all right, let me see if I can negotiate the rest. So I have no disclosures related to this topic, although our group here at the University of Illinois, due to the happenstance of geography and timing, have been consulting with most local, state, and federal agencies on this matter, and have been retained by a group of Chicago law firms to educate them in general with respect to ethylene oxide. We will do a lot of the specifics related to ethylene oxide, but actually the most interesting thing is the history of what's been happening with this since the 1980s, and for us, much more specifically, why we have become the center of some of the public's attention with respect to this issue. And that relates to the fact that the EPA did some sampling in our area and discovered that an industrial sterilization facility that was partially owned by the then governor of Illinois was exposing people in the community to a risk of cancer that was some 6 per 1,000 by an estimated risk for a lifetime exposure to cancer. And this was several-fold above the EPA's background level of 1 extra cancer per million, and their action level that runs up to 1 extra cancer by 100,000. So this got everybody's attention, and in fact got our attention While we had never previously thought about ethylene oxide and its exposures in surrounding communities, this clearly became an issue of concern. And we will explain more about that as we go ahead. The synonyms for ethylene oxide are listed on this page, and some of them are just trade names that are used by different companies. The uses of ethylene oxide began to be used as an antimicrobial pesticide in 1948. It was used primarily and built up in its usage in hospitals for sterilizing hospital equipment, including medical supplies, for example, for bandages and sutures, etc. It is additionally used and was used to treat spices and seasonings. This is an area that we have very little information about and would be very interested in others that might have more information about the continued use of ethylene oxide for this purpose. It used to treat commercial food processing, handling, and storage. It is used as a disinfectant fumigant on a variety of foodstuffs. And the primary use of ethylene oxide is as a precursor to the creation of ethylene glycol as a de-icer on airplanes and as a coolant in automobiles and trucks. This production process is entirely enclosed, though, so the concerns about ethylene oxide are focusing in on the processes that, by definition, at one point or another, are open and allow release. It has been used most recently in this country in terms of general fumigants with respect to the anthrax scare of a number of years ago, in which a white powder was sent through the mails and whole mail sorting facilities and others were then fumigated with ethylene oxide at the time. The production exceeds 11 million tons a year globally. It is a colorless glass at room temperature and normal pressure. It's in liquid when it is under higher pressure, and cooled, it has a high odor threshold, so one is not able to smell it at low levels of concern. It is extremely flammable and there is a history of explosive events related to the material, and it has an atmospheric persistence of 50 to 60 days as its half-life, and therefore a prolonged period of several months. As I indicated a moment ago, most of it is used in the creation of ethylene glycol on an industrial level. It is a direct alkylating agent that disrupts the DNA of microorganisms, and that's how it primarily has its sterilizing effect. Most of it was used in these rather small-sized ethylene oxide hospital sterilizers to sterilize packets for the emergency room, for the operating room, or any other materials that could not be put into an autoclave. In other words, could not be exposed to high pressure and temperature with water sterilization and steam sterilization. And this included almost all the materials used now in healthcare that were not metals. And those materials are primarily plastics of one sort or another. These materials now are sterilized either at the hospital, as you see on the right in these small units, And this is where reprocessing of products may take place. But on the left, you can see an industrial unit, and this is now used by manufacturers of products that are made out of plastic for healthcare prior to their being sold to healthcare facilities. Often these facilities do not know about how they were sterilized. They know they are sterile when they receive them, and they do not know how much of the residuals that are left on these items are still present when they purchase them. The processes for sterilization have 3 levels to them. One is a preconditioning, which will take several hours. The second is the sterilization phase itself, in which in the sterilizing chamber, the ethylene oxide is administered. And finally, there is an aeration stage in which the aeration chamber, a separate chamber, is heated and the ethylene oxide off gases for several hours after this point. There are standards both internationally and for us in the United States, and consensus standards within the industry about the use of ethylene oxide. None of these standards, nor the estimate of the residuals, have taken into account potential community exposures related to the carcinogenic effect. There have been many changes made to this ethylene oxide process over a period of time as they have identified the problems with the process itself, and where within the process ethylene oxide continues to be released into the working environment or into the community environment. These changes have primarily related to making the canisters that held the gas at a smaller size, a certain amount of exhaust vents above the sterilizers to suck away the ethylene oxide away from the workers' exposure, none of which were there when they first developed these processes. We used to have a lot of these in pulmonary departments, and the ones they were selling in the 1980s when we first ran into them while I was working for the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health were desktop units that leaked into offices and produced rather high levels of ethylene oxide. Routes of exposure of most interest to us are inhalation exposure. It is heavier than air, as some of the hydrogen sulfides are as well, and therefore can cause asphyxiation both in factories and in the surrounding communities at low levels. Obviously, the hierarchy of controls apply here as well as with any other equipments. And one of the things we'll get to later in this briefing is the question of a safer substitution with alternative products such as hydrogen peroxide. The industrial hygiene controls have been increased in recent times for these facilities, at least in the U.S., as this new calculation on its carcinogenic potential has become one of the regulatory components from the Environmental Protection Agency. This has to be treated as a known carcinogen that it is, and personal protective equipment at the highest level must be used. It cannot be handled with paper masks and other things of this sort. Now, there is some discussion from industry about how ubiquitous ethylene oxide is in the general environment and how the body itself creates in vivo some ethylene oxide. Of course, as always, this has a germ of truth to it, but the exposure there that develops in vivo is 100-fold less than what we are concerned about with respect to these industrial processes that can be inhaled. And more importantly, it is coming from ethylene that is released into the environment from other industrial processes as well. In other words, without the ethylene substrate, we wouldn't be seeing this amount in the general environment. How long does it stay in the body? That's an interesting question because of the concern about several month exposure or several month duration in the environment. In the body, it's very quick in its half-life of 45 to 60 minutes, so totally eliminated in a day or two. Not a constant exposure if it isn't coming from the outside. The acute exposure from ethylene oxide causes numbness and tingling in the fingers and toes. It's a neurologic toxin. It also causes a feeling of being high, drunk, causes problem with higher concentration and thinking, and is an irritant to the upper respiratory tract. These are all at quite substantial levels, often above the level that you can smell, but the upper respiratory tract irritation, as you can see from this chart, will occur before you are aware that this is happening through the smelling of the ethylene oxide. I will skip quickly through the specifics of these effects, only to come to the chronic ones for a moment, and that is both peripheral and central nervous system chronic damage occurs, renal, hematopoietic, reproductive, and carcinogenic are prominent aspects of low-level ethylene oxide exposure. And we will skip over the more specific of these results, but of course these slides are available to you. Spontaneous abortions have been noted in hospital sterilization workers and dental hygienists who had an exposure as well. But these are, again, significantly higher levels than we're concerned about with respect to the communities. Regulatory levels have been set in the past at 0.5 parts per million 8-hour time-weighted average, and a 1 part per million from OSHA for the industrial setting. On the other hand, in 2004, the human data came in from the epidemiologic studies concerning ethylene oxide, and it was noted to be a human carcinogen associated with hematopoietic cancers and breast cancer. That, on top of the animal evidence, then led the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the division of WHO that designates carcinogens, and the level of our knowledge about their impact, and that moved this from a probable carcinogen to class 1, and that is a known human carcinogen, as declared by IARC in 2006. And therefore, with a known human carcinogen, both OSHA, EPA, and NIOSH recommend lowering those levels as much as possible to de minimis levels, though that's difficult to define. That study, which was done by NIOSH on exposed populations, on worker populations, identified the odds ratio for the highest exposure group as being almost doubling the incidence of those cancers. I'm not going to give you the specifics on these studies, but Steenland in New England Journal, and then follow up by Steenland and Stainer and others while they were still with NIOSH, was the important human epidemiologic study that led us to this new concern with respect to ethylene oxide. And as we indicated before, this was lymphopoietic cancers and breast cancer most significantly, though others too were elevated, though not statistically significantly. So now in 2008, IARC decides this is class 1, now having sufficient evidence in animals and limited evidence in humans, and it has moved from the probable carcinogenic level, as I mentioned earlier. This led the EPA to readjust its cancer risk, the US EPA, as it has a standardized method of assessing cancer risk from a lifetime of exposure and for a 24-hour day exposure as well. This then
Peter,
raised the curve.
You have 5 minutes.
Good. Thank you. This then raised the curve of concern about ethylene oxide so that when the next National Air Toxics Assessment occurred in 2008, or was released in 2018, based on 2014 data, it became clear that the levels of risk in the surrounding population around some of these industrial sterilization facilities were now raised unacceptably high and were in fact driving the carcinogenic rate and risk in communities surrounding these plants in 109 communities around the country as a whole. This raised concern, and specifically here in Illinois, as regional EPA went and measured certain of the levels in the surrounding community and confirmed the theoretical modeling that had previously been done. In fact, in our area, the modeling that had been done in the confirmation was based on 2000 and 18 data, but in the 1990s, there was tenfold more of ethylene oxide released into the surrounding environment on a yearly basis than we currently were recording with the current statistical risk ratios. All right, let me quickly gloss over the local issue, but again, if you look at this level here, you see, or this chart, you see the various acceptable and control levels by regulatory agencies, and then in the middle you see the green levels that were found in and around this ethylene oxide sterilization plant, causing an elevation of breast cancer and an elevation of lymphoid cancer compared to cancer risk from other sources. Their conclusion, of course, was that this was an unacceptable incidence rate. A follow-up study was done by the state of Illinois Department of Public Health, confirming that Hodgkin's lymphoma in that area was elevated, as was breast cancer. There are many potential causes. These are just added pieces of the puzzle. So I want to spend the last couple of minutes as to alternatives rather than getting into more protective questions. And the main alternative that has been proposed and is recognized by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration as a potential alternative is hydrogen peroxide. And hydrogen peroxide seems to work equally well, not a known human carcinogen, But from an engineering point of view, the industry has raised a couple of questions that are not able to be answered as yet. And that is, first of all, ethylene oxide penetrates multiple materials better than the ethylene oxide does. Better than the hydrogen peroxide does. And second of all, it would appear that increasing the size of the sterilizing chambers outside of what is now used in hospitals with hydrogen peroxide presents some engineering problems on both the chemical and mechanical engineering end that industry would say has not been solved. The problem with their arguments that they have to use ethylene oxide is that while they're using it for some 50 to 80% of sterilization done on these kinds of healthcare products and devices, they have not tested whether or not the safety, whether or not this hydrogen peroxide as a safer alternative will work as well. What occurs is the manufacturer applies in the U.S. to the U.S. FDA. They give them the results of their studies. Their studies are generally done with ethylene oxide alone. They demonstrate that they can bring down a 6-log decrease in the microorganisms present, and the EPA approves that process then as an adequate sterilization process. But unless there is pressure brought to bear on these manufacturers, they will not attempt to go out and develop the alternative technologies that may be necessary for some of the products that have difficulty being sterilized with hydrogen peroxide or, in fact, gamma radiation or others. And that's what we really need to create, and that is a demand that we see alternative testing so that we know that, yes, in fact, this particular type of product cannot be sterilized with anything but ethylene oxide. At the moment, industry has not produced that, and industry within its own processes does not do that testing because from their point of view, they have an effective sterilizer that has been in use for 50 years. And the only increased expense in production would be if they're going to try alternative products, because nobody has raised yet the demand that these kinds of releases should not be going on in communities around these sterilizing production processes. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that was so rushed, and I think with acknowledgments to all of my colleagues that have allowed me to utilize their slides and edit them as I see fit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oris. And we're going to now hear more about both the pressure that has been brought to bear as well as leveraging the alternatives from Andres Alvarado. Welcome, Andres. Over to you.
Good morning to everyone. I would like to thank you for this great opportunity to talk about the replacement of the ethylene oxide here in Hospital Clínica Bíblica. Where can I see my presentation?
At the top of the screen, Andres, you need to click on your name that says Andres ETO, and your slides will appear.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Susan. So we are going to talk about the replacement of the ethylene oxide in a few minutes. We would like to share with you this experience, which is very important and related to all the things that Mr. Orris spoke to you in this case. Okay, first of all, I would like to talk to you about this tool, which is called failure mode and effect analysis. Once per year in our hospital, as part of our safety programs, we have to choose one important and risky process. In this case, in the year 2010, we choose the use of the ethylene oxide to do this analysis with a group of professionals and colleagues from the areas of maintenance area, nursery area, occupational health area. And this is a great opportunity to know all the things related to the risk. In this slide, you can see a summary of the process of the FMEA risk analysis. First of all, an important thing is to know all the steps related to the use of the chemical. And then we have to talk about the different failure modes and effects. We have to make a list of them. And then we have to talk about the risk and the improvement plan. As part of our accreditation with Joint Commission International, this is very related to this. In this case, these are the two standards related, the QPS 11, proactive risk analysis, and then the GLD 7.1, the review of the risk in the supply chain. This is new. And for the next FMEA analysis, this could be a good way to understand more and more these risks. And then we have to study all the failure modes, considering three variables. First of all, the occurrence of the failure mode, and then the severity, and then the detection. We have to multiply them to obtain this RPN, the risk priority number, and then we sort them in order to study the most important, just to work with them. This is a good example in this slide. I choose this one because the transportation and installation of cylinders, for example, was one of the most important problems related to the risk priority number. In this case, we have the process on the left side, you can see here, and then you have all the modes. For example, this mode which refers to the technical and awareness for the proper installation of the cylinders. In our case, our equipment was too old, and we have to move all the cylinders through the hospital to the area where the sterilization occurs. And then we have the causes. For example, in this case, the incorrect training of the personnel in charge could be a cause of this mode. And then the effect, the possible leakage of ethylene oxide. Okay, this is the new equipment. Mr. Orris spoke about the hydrogen peroxide sterilization. This is the equipment that we use here at the hospital. So, after the analysis, the FMEA analysis, we replaced the ethylene oxide in the year 2012. In this case, this equipment, the hydrogen peroxide sterilizer, is used for thermosensitive materials that do not support a temperature greater than 53.4 degrees Celsius. It is used to sterilize stainless steel materials, cannulated and non-cannulated instruments, such as scissors, lenses, and hard proofs. And one important thing is that the material that enters must be completely dry and without textiles. One of the most important things here is that this hydrogen peroxide sterilization occurs in an automated process control using a touchscreen, which you can see here on the left side. And we have two types of cycle, the lumen cycle and the non-lumen cycle, considering instruments with a length less than 1 meter and a diameter greater than 1 millimeter in this case, and on the other one, those that do not comply with these previous characteristics. Another important thing in this case is the cartridge. This cartridge is completely sealed with the hydrogen peroxide. You can see here on the left side this photograph. The people who use the equipment put the cartridge here, and later all the process is completely automatic and closed. This is very, very important talking about the risks. Right now, just to finish, I'm going to make a little process comparison of these two equipments. In this case, our ethylene oxide equipment was too old. You can see here, just by seeing the photograph, you can see that this equipment is very, very old in this case, and the equipment that we are using right now. The features in the case of ethylene oxide, It's a gas with an ether-like odor. The composition in this case was 10% ethylene oxide and the rest of the compounds. And in the case of hydrogen peroxide, it's a transparent and clear liquid and a composition with 59% of hydrogen peroxide and the rest of compounds. This is very, very important. Mr. Orris spoke about it, the carcinogenicity and mutagenicity. In the case of ethylene oxide, we have these risks. And in the case of hydrogen peroxide, we don't have it. This is very, very important and to talk about the risk. The personal protection equipment, here you can have more information. In the case of ethylene oxide, you have to use a lot of personal protection equipment, for example, the robe, the special mask and respirator for chemicals, the gloves and the safety shower. And in the case of the hydrogen peroxide, you have to use only the gloves resistant to this chemical. Mr. Orris spoke as well related to the ethylene oxide about the cycle time. In this case, for our old equipment, in the case of ethylene oxide, the cycle time was 24 hours, 1 hour, plus 23 hours of aeration. In the case of the hydrogen peroxide, this cycle takes only 1 hour. This is very, very important, related as well, talking about the productivity of the process. The controls, this is very, very important as well. In the case of the ethylene oxide, you have to use a lot of controls. You can see here all pictures about our system, the injection and air extraction system, which is very, very important in a possible leakage spill. The safe handling of the pressurized cylinders, this is as well very, very important. And the environmental monitoring, considering a possible leakage or spill. In the case of the hydrogen peroxide, you only need to put the cartridge and that's it. So this is a good comparison related to the controls in this case. And finally, we have some information about the risk related to the globally harmonized system. In the case of the ethylene oxide, we have a lot of risk. You can see here that it's a flammable chemical. You have here pressure gas as well. It is toxic. And you can see, talking about the hydrogen peroxide, that we have less risks. So thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Andres Alvarado from Clinica Biblica. And it's great to have an example of this process of failure and risk analysis that led to the changes there. We have a number of questions that have come in. We're still accepting questions in the chat box. I will start with a question for you, Andres, which is, when you were doing this analysis and making the change at Clinica Biblica, what were the training and education necessary for staff and for procurement colleagues in order to make the substitution? Was there, what were the challenges? Was there resistance that you had to overcome?
Okay, thank you for the question. I can tell you, Susan, that at that moment in the year 2010, this was our first FMEA analysis. So we didn't know anything about how to do it. So we have to, at that moment, we had a training with a company here in Costa Rica just to understand how to do it, this risk analysis. So we make a group of professionals from different areas: engineering, administration, quality department, nurturing, which is very important in order to talk about the uses of this equipment. And then we had this training, first of all, to understand how to do this risk analysis. And then we went to the place, we studied all the use of the sterilization process and starting all the analysis.
Thank you. Dr. Oris, a couple of questions for you. I'm going to give you two questions at once. Are you aware of any state or government officially recommending the elimination and substitution of ethylene oxide? The second question is the testing of exposures and exposure limits up to manufacturers, or is there a role for government agencies to help in the testing for alternative sterilizing agents?
Well, let's take the second first. This is set up differently in different countries, of course, but as part of a licensing process, it ought to be the expense and of the manufacturer to produce these studies, which then need to be reviewed by the government agency. And in fact, here in the U.S., that's what happens. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, reviews the reports from the manufacturers about their recommended and tested approaches to sterilizing the products they produce. The problem with that is that they go to their tried and true tested methodology without concern about developing methodologies that are friendlier to exposure to both the workers and the communities. As to the government agency's approach in Illinois, the new governor after the elections closed down this sterilizing facility in the western suburbs in Chicago, and there is now open debate going on about exactly how the law should be written with respect to what are the obligations of that sterilizing facility in terms of what kind of internal controls, how far away from residential areas, and a variety of the other aspects. On a global level, both NIOSH and OSHA and EPA in the U.S. for known human carcinogens recommends that we move to safer substitution with other products if technically feasible. And that would be covering the ethylene oxide as well. The furthest the FDA has gone in that matter, in 2016, is to come out with an advisory that they feel that hydrogen peroxide is a well-known and usable alternative. That led most hospitals to phase out the use of ethylene oxide, and there are very few hospitals any longer. About 10 hospitals in the state of Illinois, about 5% of the hospitals still use ethylene oxide. But again, that's the smaller capabilities. Where most of the ethylene oxide is used today is for these large industrialized production processes determined by the manufacturers.
Couple follow-up questions for you, Peter. Two at once. Should we be asking manufacturers that use ethylene oxide to do their own air testing outside facilities to ensure they're not off-gassing into the environment like Sterigenics was? And for those products, and this is a U.S. FDA-approved question, that where products don't have an approved alternative for sterilization as part of their manufacturing licensing, what kinds of questions can we ask the manufacturer or processor to ensure that they're using PTO as safely as possible?
Well, the end of that sentence is more complicated. The beginning of the sentence or the beginning of the question, what should we be asking? It's not just a question of what has been approved of FDA, because the initiation of what gets approved is with the manufacturers. The question needs to go to the next step, and that says, please show us the studies that demonstrate that we can't use a safer alternative. Right now, the contracting groups that do this sterilization, their trade agency has come back and said, we have to do it. The FDA makes us do it. It's the only approved process. Yes, but it's the only approved process because it's the only process that they asked for approval for, or rather the manufacturers did. Now, how to make this process that is by definition not an enclosed process, because you must take the materials out of the sterilizer and put the materials into an aerator. How we can make that process safer is an industrial hygiene question, but I can tell you that through all of the changes that have been recommended for hospitals and with respect to changing the way that the sterilizers are constructed, etc., and exhausted, still they lose ethylene oxide into the atmosphere, and we don't know the lower levels. We are unable to say here's a safe level of a known human carcinogen, because we believe in general that every exposure increases the risk of this. So that is our problem with respect to, for instance, Stereogenics, which is the company that we're concerned about in Willowbrook. When they put in even more controls than they had before, when this issue was raised, they resampled and they discovered that the levels were the same in the general community. There are undoubtedly other exposures to this as well that we have to define that have not yet been defined.
Thank you very much. Important takeaway is that the safe level of exposure hasn't been demonstrated. A couple questions have come in for Andres. Practical question: how many medical products can the hydrogen peroxide machine that you demonstrated treat at one time? And second question, what is the cost implication in using the hydrogen peroxide sterilizers? How many manufacturers exist for these types of sterilizers? Andres.
Okay, in the case of the quantity of manufacturers, I think, I don't know exactly the quantity to be realized with that, but I know only one in this case related to the equipment that we are using here. Well, what's the other question, Susan?
How many products can you sterilize at a time in the machine?
In the chamber?
Yes.
Okay, to tell you the truth, right now, I don't know exactly. I could answer for the people who wanted to know that, and I can tell you later. But right now, I don't know exactly. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. And if you respond with the answer to me, we'll make sure that it gets distributed to the participants in this session.
I'll do it. Okay, I'll do it.
And the last question is, what is the cost implications for the new process with hydrogen peroxide?
Yeah, we have studied more or less the hydrogen peroxide is more, it's like 10% more expensive comparing to the ethylene oxide cost. But we have a lot of good situations related to the risks, So in this case, we have decided to use it. It's expensive, yeah, that's a situation, but we prefer to use hydrogen peroxide considering all the risks.
Thank you. And Dr. Oris, a couple more questions for you as we come upon the end of the hour. Question from the Association of Medical Instrumentation in the U.S. What is the data to support the 100-fold difference between the risks associated with ethylene oxide between environmental and that from hospital sterilizers?
Yes, and I didn't have that reference on the slide. That's a very good question. They should email me and we'll find it. That's one of the issues that is being investigated, as well as the issues of what are the other sources in the environment, because the industry has said, look, we're not the only source of this. And there's an active discussion going on about that. And then additionally, what is the level that you find from the this ambient ethylene in the environment, and what levels does it get to in the body. But if they just email me, we'll get that back to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you again to Dr. Peter Oris and to Andres Alvarado for a very important presentation and suggestions and help for us about how to investigate hazards in general and then specifically the alternatives for ethylene oxide. With that, I want to thank you all for participating. For those of you who have joined us who are not yet a member of the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals, on screen you can see the slide that gives you information about who is eligible and how to join the network. We welcome your participation. And I wanted to announce that the next webinar will be hosted by our colleagues in Brussels from Healthcare Without Harm Europe on sustainable procurement about the hazards and safer substitutes of disinfectants on 27 June 2019. Stay tuned for more information about how to register for that webinar, which will be in the afternoon of Central Europe time and morning for North Americans. Again, thank you all for joining us, and to our speakers, the presentations will be available on the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals site, and the tape of this webinar will also be available online. Have a great day or evening. Bye now.
Thank you, Susan. Bye.